Hi, I'm Rod Bryant. Welcome to this next installment. We're going to be talking about the Noahide laws, how they're actually derived. There has been some, not debate, but criticism from those who are anti-Noahide, usually coming from the Christian community, who is slightly anti-Semitic. Will say the Noahide laws were just derived by a bunch of rabbis, and it's the Jews' way of trying to control non-Jews. And here we're going to find that there is actually a way that the laws were derived that's going to make sense to you. And the only way for a non-Jew, non-Noahide to be able to understand that is to take this course, to be able to understand that the laws of Hashem are derived in a very unique way, and they're not always explicit. And the use of the language and the process of interpretation has everything to do with the way the laws are understood. So as we go through this lesson, you're going to understand very quickly how the laws are derived. In the previous lessons, we got sort of a bird's eye view of the landscape of Torah learning. We reviewed many of the core texts and how they have shaped observance and study of Torah in the diaspora. We also have discussed the chain of Torah transmission and authority of authentic Torah interpretation. In this lesson, we're going to look at how the Noahide laws fit into the landscape of Torah learning, how they're derived from the Torah, and how they are interpreted. This lesson is an important precursor to the discussion of the Noahide laws in practice. First, let's look at the sources of the Noahide laws. Until this point in this course, we have translated the Hebrew word mitzvah as commandment. However, this translation doesn't fully capture the essence of mitzvah, the word mitzvah. A mitzvah is best defined as expression of God's will. Any expression of God's will or desire, whether stated explicit, or merely intimated, it is a mitzvah. This is true of both the 613 mitzvahs given to the Jewish people and the 7 Noahide mitzvahs given to all mankind. The Noahide laws are not explicitly stated in any one place of the Torah. For this matter, neither are most of the other commandments in the Torah. The Noahide laws are communicated in a number of ways and in a number of places. As we see, they are even derived from mitzvahs given after Sinai. Now let's first look at the explicit commandments. These are going to be fairly obvious to you, and anyone with a basic introduction of the Genesis story will recognize some of these commandments. This one, for example, or these were given to mankind via Adam and Noah. Here's a few examples, and I'll give you the verses after I quote the verse. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, the bird of the sky, and every living thing that moves on the earth." Genesis 1:28. Here's another one. "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Genesis 2:24. How about this one? "But flesh with its soul is its blood, you shall not eat." Genesis 9:4. Here's another one. "However, your blood that belongs to your souls will demand of every beast, I will demand it, but of man, of every man, for that of his brother, I will demand the soul of a man, whoever sheds the blood of man. By men shall his blood be shed, and you shall be fruitful and multiply upon the earth and increase upon it." Genesis 9:4-7. Now it appears that these commandments were intended for all mankind, frankly, because they were given to the progenitors of the human race. God further instructed Abraham and his descendants in his will right up until the Exodus from Sinai. For example, he commanded Abraham in the mitzvah of circumcision. Many further commandments were given in Egypt prior and during the liberation. The example would be the enumerated laws of Passover and sacrifice, those mitzvahs. However, not all of these expressions of divine will are direct to all people. The commandments given to Noah and Adam are clearly relevant to all people. However, those given to Abraham and his descendants are limited to them alone. For example, Genesis 17:10 through 13, it says, "Every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. Every male among you shall be circumcised. He that is born in your household shall be circumcised." Now, we see that the Torah limits this commandment to the members of Abraham's family. This is the first factor in deriving the Noahide laws. Not all commandments from before the giving of the Torah were intended for all people. Some are universals, others are only for families and descendants of the patriarchs and of the Jewish people. Commands recorded before Sinai were not always given before Sinai. And here's a couple of examples. Genesis 32:33. "Therefore, until this day, the children of Israel do not eat the displaced sinew on the hip socket, for he struck Yaakov's hip socket on the displaced sinew." It seems that a commandment was given at this point prohibiting the sciatic sinew. The Talmud, however, notes that oddity, and in this verse, the Torah uses the term children of Israel. This is surprising because Jacob would not have his name changed until later on in Genesis 35:10, well after the events discussed here. The Talmud discusses this oddity, including that the commandment against eating the sinew was in fact given at Sinai. Yet since eating the sinew is prohibited as a commemoration of Yaakov's struggle, Moses recorded the mitzvah in its relevant place in Genesis. The language that states "until this day" is explained by the same reasoning. Now, our second factor in deriving the Noahide laws, Torah laws for Noahides, not all mitzvahs written before Sinai, for example, Exodus chapter 20, are necessarily commanded before the revelation at Sinai, until revelation at Sinai took place. Let's look at implicit mitzvahs. God often expresses his will clearly. Sometimes, however, God's will is derived by implication. And here's an example. God tells Noah that he's going to destroy the world on account of it being filled with robbery and having corrupted its way upon the earth. By implication, robbery and corruption, its way, must be abhorrent and punishable. By seeking to understand the exact parameters and boundaries of these two issues, we can discern God's will for his creation. That there are many other places in the Torah prior to Sinai where God's will is similarly implied. This leads us to our third principle in understanding the laws for Noahides. A few of the Noahide laws are not directly commanded, but are rather implied by the history of God's relationship with mankind. Let's chat just a moment about the repetition at Sinai. Some of the Noahide laws, whether communicated explicitly or implicitly, are repeated by God when giving the Torah at Sinai. For example, against murder, theft. Others would be like, "Be fruitful and multiply." If these laws are universal, already incumbent on mankind, then what is the point of repeating them again? And if there is some need for their repetition, then why only some of them are repeated? The rabbis of the Talmud discusses this question in depth, comparing examples, looking at specific cases, and eventually derive the only conclusion that makes sense and are consistent with the rest of Torah. Number one, a mitzvah applying to the Noahides and repeated at Sinai applies to both Noahides and Jews. A mitzvah applying to Noahides and not repeated at Sinai only applies to Jews. God repeated the Noahide laws at Sinai for several reasons. The giving of the Torah modified many aspects of the original Noahidic covenant, and this will be discussed later in our course. Among the changes it caused was that it revised the universal quality of many of the mitzvahs given before Sinai. Once the Torah was entrusted to Israel, all commandments given before Sinai ceased to be universal and instead applied only to the Jews. However, God wanted the universal quality of certain mitzvahs to carry over into the post-Sinai world. Another reason is that God wanted to place specific universal laws clearly under the Torah umbrella for learning and interpretation. Now we're going to examine the difference between Jewish and Noahide laws. The Talmud, in its analysis of Noahide laws, derive another principle. There is nothing permitted to a Jew which is forbidden to a Noahide. This rule directly related to the two that we just learned, applied only in the matters of prohibition. For example, there is no food that is kosher for a Jew, yet not kosher for a Noahide. This rule does not apply to positive commandments. Many commandments given to Israel modify the parameters of the Noahide laws. Last general principle to know is this: commandments given to the Jews at Sinai modify the application of Noahide laws. For example, take the following verse: anyone who blasphemes the name of God shall be put to death, as well as the convert and the native born. Leviticus 24:16. This verse is discussing the punishment for those who curse God. God has many names, and the verse is teaching the execution is only applied to one who curses God's true name, while blaspheming lesser names is nonetheless prohibited. A native-born Jew and a convert are not put to death for doing so, and that is blaspheming against a lesser God. The Talmud is bothered by this phrase, convert and the native alike. Obviously, this verse must be speaking of both Jewish people. After all, it is being given at Sinai. So why does the Torah need to specify to us that it only applies to converts and native-born Jews? Now, the reason is pretty simple, is that the verse wishes to exclude Noahides from this teaching. The verse is saying that only Jews are executed for cursing one of God's true names and are not executed for cursing lesser names. However, Noahides are executed for cursing even lesser names of God. So bottom line, Noahides are given more restriction to say that they are not allowed to curse or denigrate or make common the holy name of God or anything attaining to God. Applying these principles, by overlaying all of these principles and filtering the Torah through them, the Noahide laws and their structure begins to emerge. However, it takes tremendous amount of scholarship and intense knowledge of the text and methods involved to derive the laws. The good news is that the rabbis of the Talmud have recorded much of the analysis for us. Most of it's concentrated in tractate Sanhedrin 56 to 60. The specific lesson being an overview is not the place to map out in detail the derivation of each Noahide law. We will, however, discuss their derivation through this course as we explore the laws in depth. A complete summary will be provided as an appendix at the end of the course. Exactly how many Noahide laws are there? Applying the Talmud's principle of derivation, we discover that there are about 30 Noahide laws. The Talmud itself in Tractate Chulin 92a confirms this number. However, the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin 56a tells us that there are only 7 Noahide laws. So how many are there? 7 or 30? Rabbi Aharon Halevi Barcelona explains the contradiction in his Sefer HaChinuk 4:24. States, make no mistake in the enumeration of the 7 laws, which we well know are recorded in the Talmud. They are but categories which contain many particulars. For example, you will find sexual prohibition grouped into one category. This category, however, has many specifics, such as prohibition of homosexuality or bestiality. Similarly, with regards to idolatry, they have one commandment with numerous parts. Now, the earliest reference to the Noahide laws, the Talmud notes that the earliest reference to the laws is an apparently unrelated verse. Genesis 1:29 says, God gave every tree to Adam for food. God said, every tree that has seed bearing fruit, it shall be for you food. The same idea is repeated shortly thereafter in Genesis 2:16. And then later on, let's see, 2:16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you shall surely eat. However, this repetition is strange. For one, the Torah never repeats itself without purpose. A repetition must add something not previously known. Another issue is the language of the verse. If God is giving Adam the trees as food, then why does God have to command the man? The Talmud notes that these oddities, also noting that the original Hebrew verses divides into 7 clauses. The sages of blessed memory in Sanhedrin 56b conclude that each clause is a subtitle reference to one of the 7 mitzvahs. So the 7 Noahide laws are mostly prohibitions. However, many of the commentators interpret each prohibition as implying a positive mitzvah as well. So let's enumerate these 7 laws. And I will kind of give the simple explanation. More detailed explanation is in your course material. Establishing courts of justice, prohibition against blasphemy, prohibition of idolatry, the prohibition of murder, the prohibition of incest and sexual immorality, the prohibition of theft, the prohibition of eating a limb torn from a living animal. And later on, we're going to find out that these are actually we've already learned there's 7 categories. Each one of them are filtered into the root of 613. Now, there are statements for 30 Noahide laws, and let me show you how the 7 are rooted into 30, which are rooted into probably 70 more laws. Let me give you an example. If the Torah Noahide law says to not if, but when it says to not conduct sexual immorality, well, one must consult the rest of the Torah to find out, how does God enumerate sexual immorality and what does it mean? That's how we find out, and that's why we find that a lot of the study of Torah laws, or the 613, that may not directly apply to the Noahide, indirectly does for sure, because it gives us the parameters by which the 7 are determined. Now, the earliest surviving statement of the Noahide laws with their explained derivations is from the Torah commentary of Rabbi Shmuel ben Chofni of Gaon. He lived around 1034 in Iraq. Here's how his is broken down. Idolatry. Belief in one God, prohibition of idolatry. It's to offer ritual sacrifices, one's to honor father and mother, prohibition of worshiping of Moloch, prohibition of witchcraft, prohibition of soothsaying, prohibition of conjuring and conjures, prohibition against sorcery and sorcerers, prohibition against consulting the dead, prohibition consulting demons, prohibition of black arts, voodoo, invoking spirits for a favor, prohibition of necromancy. Next of the category, blasphemy. Prohibition of blasphemy meant that we are to pray as a mitzvah. Prohibition of false oath. Here's the next category, prohibition of suicide, prohibition of murder are those 2 things. Sexual immorality. Here we go. There is prohibition of adultery, to engage in formal marriage, prohibition of incest with a sister, prohibition of homosexuality, prohibition of bestiality, prohibition of castration. Whew, we're getting through this. And not to eat torn from a living animal. Here are the other ones that are derived from that one. Prohibition of eating a limb of an animal that died naturally. Prohibition of eating a limb of a living animal. Prohibition of eating or drinking blood. Prohibition of crossbreeding animals. Now let's look at justice, to establish courts of justice. And last but not least, the prohibition of theft and robbery. With that being said, you're going to find out, and in your course material, there are more lists from other rabbis that have enumerated these laws with either something added or something that is not added to that list. Now, later authorities have further derivations to these lists, and these lists are neither the definitive nor the final derivation of the Torah laws. I would venture to say that as Noahidism grows in the nations, there are going to be more clarification given to the Noahide community from our rabbis. There's only one statement of the core principles. As later authorities have pointed out, living the laws in practice requires further exploration and subdivision of the mitzvahs. In the next lesson, we're going to address the guiding principles unique to each category of the Torah laws. Let me prepare the foundation. At this point, although we are devoting much to discussion of the legal aspect of the Noahide laws, we must remember that the mitzvahs are not just legal decrees, they're actual divine expressions of God's will and have psychological, mystical, and spiritual effect on the entire world. And we'll explore the metaphysical, mystical, and spiritual aspects of the Noahide law shortly. However, a solid grasp of these basic principles is important to fully appreciate the deeper aspect of the 7 mitzvahs. I hope that you've enjoyed this class. If there are any questions, we'd encourage you to send us an email, nativ, N-E-T-I-V, center @gmail.com, or join us on Sunday evening at 4 p.m. for the Zoom Q&A session every Sunday evening at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And if you would like to join that, please let us know by going to the website and sending us a note saying, add me to the discussion, and we'll send you the schedule and the link. Until next class, shalom.